You know the feeling when you do something rubbish and everyone thinks it's amazing. You don't? Well, that's because you're not a genius or 3 years old. This is the story of 5 pieces of music their composers looked down their noses on, were embarrassed by, or even just plain hated. And how all but one became not only popular, but the most famous music their dismissive creators ever wrote. In 1886, Camille Saint-Saens was distracted on working of his Symphony No. 3 for organ and orchestra. Yeah, that one. He was distracted by a project that had taken up his fancy. A pet project, you might say. A 14-movement piece depicting a menagerie of animals, tortoises, elephants, fishes, swans, a carnival of animals, as the piece would come to be known. Saint-Saens showed his friends the piece, and it was well received. It's certainly a lot of fun. However, the composer worried this apparently frivolous work would overshadow his more serious work, and he banned it from any public performance for his entire life. Only after Saint-Saens died in 1921, at the age of 91, did his will finally allow the public to hear the Carnival of Animals. And, quelle surprise, the public loved it. Today, despite the lifetime ban of its creator, the Carnival of Animals has become one of Saint-Saens' best loved and most celebrated pieces. This was the piece that made Rachmaninoff famous. He composed it in 1892 when he was only 19 years old, his first work after finishing as a student at the Moscow Academy. The piece was singled out by critics at its premiere and quickly became popular. Rachmaninoff had reached international fame by the 1920s, principally as a concert pianist, and audiences would begin to demand encores of what became simply known as the Prelude. It irked Rachmaninoff, and it irked him increasingly. When he toured USA Minnesota in 1921, Rachmaninoff himself explained to a reporter, "I am often sorry I wrote it. I can never escape from a concert hall without playing it. It pursues me everywhere. I have a feeling that the public comes to my concerts only to hear me play that one selection, and they sit through the rest of the concert just waiting for it, and I have become very tired of it." There may be another reason the piece so irritated the composer. When the Prelude was published in 1893, Rachmaninoff was only paid 40 rubles as a one-off payment. His publisher didn't pay any royalties, so even after the piece exploded in popularity, Sergei himself didn't get any bucks for the bang. It couldn't have helped his feelings about the piece. Bolero is an unusual piece. It's basically one whopping 15-minute crescendo. Ravel himself thought people wouldn't like the piece, and was even surprised that orchestras were willing to play it. Whilst composing it, he said the piece had no form, properly speaking, no development, no or almost no modulation. He expanded, "It constitutes an experiment in a very special and limited direction, and should not be suspected of aiming at achieving anything different from, or anything more than it actually does achieve." Low expectations, indeed. One story runs that at the Bolero premiere, an old woman supposedly screamed, it's mad," at the top of her voice during the performance. When Ravel was told of the incident, he said, "That lady, she got it." Myth or reality, Ravel's limited experiment has since become his most celebrated piece. It was the title piece of the eponymous 1935 film and has been used countless times since. I myself have met the piece twice before I even got into classical music. Firstly, watching Torval and Dean ice skate in the 1980s, and then again at a film festival in the 90s, an excellent short film by Patrick Leconte that focuses, in a single take, on the snare drummer playing the piece. The audience at the festival loved the film. Part of the reason, no doubt, is that the music manages to sustain so well for its entire duration, despite those worries of its creator. It all started with a church, the Church of Our Saviour in Moscow to be precise, which was ordered to be built by Tsar Alexander I in celebration of Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812 and in commemoration of the sacrifice of the Russian people. Unfortunately, the church took rather a long time to actually build, over 70 years in fact. So, snap cut to 1883 and Tchaikovsky is asked to write a piece to commemorate the completion of the cathedral. The year before the opening of the cathedral, Tchaikovsky's new overture was premiered in a tent just outside the massive, unfinished building. Tchaikovsky wrote the overture quickly, and he wrote it for the money. He himself didn't have a high opinion of the work, telling the commissioners, "I shan't be the slightest bit surprised or offended if you find it unsuitable for concert performance." He wrote privately that the overture was very loud and noisy, but without artistic merit, because I wrote it without warmth and without love. That's not stopped it from being one of his most celebrated works. In fact, one of the most celebrated works of classical music, full stop. The piece even reached number 1 in the 2018 Classic FM Hall of Fame. I myself have always liked the work, with its easy melody and pleasurable rhythmic thrust. But I have to admit, with continued exposure, the piece can start to sound a little bombastic. The cathedral itself, well, that's currently the home of Father Kirill, who spews lies from his pulpit to justify Putin's awful war in Ukraine. Bombastic might be appropriate after all. Saint Sibelius, the great Finnish composer, was already considered the world's greatest living symphonist. He completed his 7th symphony in 1924. Two years later, he began his 8th. The composer informed the New York Times he'd already written 2 movements and had 2 others composed in his head. Many conductors were desperate to premiere the piece, and the composer was badgered constantly by a number of very famous maestros. The 1930s came, still no symphony. In 1931, Sibelius wrote to a friend, "The symphony is making great strides." But still, nothing appeared. Sibelius by this time was drinking more and more, and wasn't composing anything. This was the period that would later become simply known as the Silence. Suddenly a breakthrough. In 1932, Sibelius told the conductor Koussevitzky that he could have the premiere in October. October came and went. Still no symphony. In 1933, Sibelius wrote about the symphony in his diary. "I'm taking everything another way, more deeply." Whatever new direction he took the symphony, nothing came from the Silence. In 1945, Sibelius took a laundry basket of manuscripts into his garden and burned them all. Sibelius died in 1951. The day after his death, his daughter confirmed the awful news for the musicologists of the future. If the 8th Symphony had ever existed, it didn't anymore. That symphony must have weighed heavily on the old composer. His wife said the burning his manuscripts in 1945 had brought Sibelius great peace. The rest, as they say, is silence.